4 city blocks in Milwaukee. 1960, a 6-story brick fortress churning out beer so exclusive that factory workers couldn't afford a single glass. Gettelman brewing the $1,000 beer that wasn't actually $1,000, but felt like it. Doctors and lawyers lined up to pay triple the going rate. 800 workers, 180,000 barrels a year. Profit margins that made competitors weep with envy. Then Miller Brewing walked in with a checkbook. 5 years later, gone. Every recipe destroyed. Every bottle vanished. The building razed to dirt and paved over for parking. Today, collectors pay $500 for a single bottle, if they can find one. The beer that made Milwaukee jealous became the beer Milwaukee erased from history. This is the story of how America's most profitable small brewery got swallowed whole. How a family that survived Prohibition, 2 world wars, and the Depression couldn't survive their own success. And how the one thing that made them special, their obsession with perfection, signed their death warrant. Adam Gettelman was born in 1824 in a village outside Munich that no longer exists. The borders shifted twice during his childhood. His father brewed beer for local estates, not commercially, but as a hired craftsman who moved from property to property. By the time Adam was 12, he could identify 23 varieties of hops by smell alone. This wasn't exceptional talent. In Bavaria, if your father brewed, you learned or you starved. The revolution of 1848 changed everything. Not the grand political revolution. Adam didn't care about that, the personal one. His older brother inherited the family's brewing contracts. Adam got nothing. Primogeniture was the law. Second sons had 3 options: the church, the military, or the Atlantic crossing. He chose the Atlantic. 24 years old, 60 marks in his pocket, 1 trunk containing his clothes, and a leather journal where his father had recorded 40 years of brewing notes. He arrived in New York in June 1849, worked on the docks for 8 months, saved every penny, and bought a train ticket to Milwaukee. Why Milwaukee? Because 13 other Bavarian brewers had already settled there, and they needed workers who actually understood the craft. The Milwaukee Adam found in 1850 was barely a city, population 20,000, mostly German immigrants. The infrastructure was primitive, unpaved streets, wooden sidewalks, open sewers. But it had something Bavaria didn't: cheap land, abundant water, and a German population large enough to appreciate proper lager beer. American beer at the time was mostly ale, warm fermented, quick to produce, profitable but unsophisticated. The German brewers who'd arrived earlier were already teaching Milwaukee to drink differently. Adam worked for Jacob Best's brewery for 6 years, not as a brewer initially, as a cooper. He made the barrels. This turned out to be the best possible education. He saw every step of the process. He learned which wood held flavor, which didn't. He understood why some beers spoiled in transport and others didn't. Most importantly, he watched how Jacob Best ran a business. The old man was good at brewing, adequate at business, and terrible at expansion. Adam learned what not to do. In 1856, he had saved $1,847. He found a partner, another Bavarian immigrant named George Schweikert, who had money but no brewing knowledge. They bought a small plot on Juneau Avenue for $600, built a modest brewery building for $1,200, spent the remaining $47 on equipment, mostly used. The first batch was 60 barrels of Milwaukee lager. Medium-bodied, clean finishing, absolutely conventional. It sold locally. They broke even the first year. Here's what Adam understood that most immigrant brewers didn't. Milwaukee already had good beer. What it didn't have was great beer for people who could afford to care about the difference. While his competitors focused on volume and price, Adam focused on something that seemed economically insane, making beer that cost more to produce than most saloons wanted to pay. The second year, he started experimenting, not with recipes, with process. He extended the lagering period from 6 weeks to 12. He imported Saaz hops directly from Bohemia instead of buying domestic. He threw out entire batches if they didn't meet standards that existed only in his head. His partner thought he was destroying the business. The numbers said otherwise. By 1858, Gettleman was selling 200 barrels annually at prices 30% higher than competitors. Small volume, high margin, a formula that would define the company for the next century. The phrase didn't appear until 1891, but the concept started in 1862. That was the year Adam made a decision that would create the Gettelman mystique. He would brew a beer so expensive, so carefully crafted, that ordinary Milwaukee workers couldn't afford it even if they wanted to. Picture the calculation. Most Milwaukee breweries in the 1860s were selling beer for $2 to $3 per barrel. Gettleman's standard lager was already at $4, a premium price justified by quality. But Adam had been experimenting with something different. A lager that used twice the malt, twice the hops, aged for 6 months instead of 3. The production cost per barrel was $9. To make any profit at all, he'd have to charge $12. His partner Schweikert said it was commercial suicide. Who would pay $12 for a barrel of beer when perfectly good beer cost $3? Adam's answer was simple: people who have $12. And in 1862, Milwaukee, there were enough of them to matter. The city was transforming. The population had hit 45,000. Manufacturing was exploding: leather tanning, ironworks, grain processing. A merchant class was emerging, not just German immigrants anymore, but American-born entrepreneurs who'd made money in the Civil War boom. These men wanted beer that signaled status. Gettleman gave it to them. The beer was called Gettleman's Extra Pale Lager. The pale was important. It was lighter in color than typical Milwaukee lagers, which required more expensive malt and more precise temperature control. The flavor profile was different too. Where most Milwaukee beers were malty and heavy, Gettleman's was crisp, almost delicate, hop-forward, but not bitter. It was beer for people who actually paid attention to what they were drinking. Here's where the marketing genius came in. Adam didn't try to sell it everywhere. He sold it to exactly 6 establishments in Milwaukee: the best hotel, 3 private clubs, and 2 high-end restaurants. That was it. If you wanted Gettleman's Extra Pale, you had to go where rich people went. The scarcity wasn't artificial. The brewery genuinely couldn't produce more than 400 barrels per year of this particular beer while maintaining quality. But the scarcity created mystique. By 1870, something remarkable had happened. The standard Gettelman lager was selling 2,000 barrels annually at $5 per barrel. The Extra Pale was selling 500 barrels at $15 per barrel. The profit from the Extra Pale alone exceeded the profit from the standard lager. The company employed 47 people. The facility had expanded to fill half a city block. Then came the fire, August 1871. Not the Chicago fire. That came 2 months later and got all the attention. The Gettelman Brewery fire destroyed everything: the building, the equipment, 2 years' worth of aging beer. Insurance covered maybe 40% of the loss. Adam was 47 years old, essentially starting over. Most brewers in his position would have rebuilt smaller, cheaper, safer. Adam did the opposite. He bought the entire city block, built a 6-story brick brewery designed by an architect who'd studied German brewery design, installed state-of-the-art cooling systems that allowed year-round production, still rare in American brewing. The total cost was $87,000. He had $23,000 in insurance money and savings. The rest he borrowed at 8% interest. This is the moment where character determines destiny. Adam could have played it safe, focused on volume, paid down the debt. Instead, he doubled down on premium. The new facility was designed around the Extra Pale production. Separate brewing rooms, separate aging cellars, separate bottling lines. While competitors were building breweries that could pivot between products based on market demand, Gettleman built a brewery that could only do one thing: make expensive beer perfectly. The gamble paid off faster than anyone expected. By 1875, the debt was paid. By 1880, Gettleman was the most profitable small brewery in Wisconsin. And in 1891, a Chicago journalist writing about Milwaukee's beer culture used the phrase that would stick: Gettleman's the $1,000 beer. He was exaggerating. A barrel cost $18 by then. But the myth was more valuable than accuracy. Adam Gettelman died in 1897, 73 years old, in the bedroom above his brewery. He'd never retired. Worked 6 days a week until the final month. The funeral procession stretched 14 blocks. Milwaukee's German business elite treated it like a state funeral. The brewery shut down for 3 days, the only time it would ever voluntarily stop production until 1966. His son, Louis, had been running day-to-day operations for 12 years. If Adam built the brand, Louis built the machine. He was 39 when his father died, and he understood something crucial. Premium brewing in the 20th century would require industrial precision that artisanal methods couldn't deliver. Between 1898 and 1905, Louis transformed Gettleman from a craftsman's brewery into a precision manufacturing operation. He brought in chemical engineers from Germany to standardize every step of the process. He installed the first spectrophotometer in a Milwaukee brewery, a device that measured the exact color of beer in production. He created written specifications for every stage, every ingredient, every temperature, every timing. The brewing process that Adam had carried in his head and his instincts was now documented in 247 pages of technical standards. The workers hated it at first. Brewers who'd worked by feel and experience suddenly had to follow specifications to the third decimal point. But Louis understood what his competitors didn't. As American brewing scaled up, only two types of breweries would survive: the massive ones that competed on price and volume, and the premium ones that competed on absolute consistency. There was no middle ground. The numbers proved him right. Between 1900 and 1910, Wisconsin lost 37 breweries to consolidation or bankruptcy. Gettleman not only survived, but grew. Production increased from 12,000 barrels annually to 28,000. 90% of it was still the premium extra pale lager. The price had climbed to $22 per barrel, while competitors were selling at $5 to $7. Here's what made the Gettleman operation unique. They were making money while producing a fraction of what their competitors produced. Pabst was producing 1.2 million barrels annually by 1910. Schlitz was at 1.3 million. Gettleman was at 28,000. But Gettleman's profit per barrel was 6 times higher. The company employed 240 people and paid them 30% above industry standard. Why? Because precision brewing required skilled workers who actually gave a damn. Turnover was expensive. Louis paid enough that people stayed. The facility itself became a Milwaukee landmark. 6 stories of red brick, with the Gettleman name painted in letters 4 feet tall on the east wall. Tours were by invitation only. Louis understood that exclusivity was part of the brand. Could handle only 800 bottles per hour, absurdly slow by industry standards, because each bottle was inspected by hand before capping. Louis' son Erwin joined the operation in 1912, fresh from a chemistry degree at the University of Wisconsin. 3 generations of Gettlemans, 3 different skill sets. Adam had been the craftsman. Louis was the engineer. Erwin was the scientist. And by the time Prohibition arrived in 1920, this combination would prove to be the company's salvation. January 16, 1920. The Volstead Act became law. Every brewery in America faced the same choice: shut down or pivot. Most of Milwaukee's breweries chose to pivot. They made near beer 0.5% alcohol or less, malt syrup, soft drinks, ice cream. Gettleman did something different. Erwin Gettelman, now effectively running the company while his father Louis handled administration, made a calculated bet. Prohibition wouldn't last forever, and when it ended, the breweries that had maintained their expertise would have a massive advantage. But maintaining expertise meant keeping your brewers employed and practicing their craft. You couldn't do that making ice cream. The solution was technically legal, but ethically questionable. Gettleman would produce malt extract, a concentrated syrup that was supposedly for baking, but everyone knew was actually for home brewing. The legal language was carefully crafted. The labels said, "For baking use only." The instructions were detailed enough that anyone who followed them would produce approximately 7% alcohol beer in their basement. But here's the crucial detail: Gettleman didn't cheap out on the malt extract. While competitors were producing generic brown syrup, Gettleman produced a hop-infused, precisely formulated extract that, when properly used, actually produced decent beer. The price point was high: $3 for a can that would produce 2 gallons of beer. That was expensive compared to bootleg liquor, but cheap compared to what Gettleman beer had cost before Prohibition. The margins were extraordinary. The malt extract cost 40 cents to produce and sold for $3. The company employed only 85 people during Prohibition, down from 240. But the profit per employee actually increased. And most importantly, the brewing staff stayed employed. They weren't making beer, but they were maintaining the expertise. Every batch of malt extract required the same precision, the same understanding of malts and hops, the same quality control. Think about that for a second. While Pabst and Schlitz pivoted to completely different industries and laid off most of their brewing staff, Gettleman kept its core team intact. When Prohibition ended in 1933, Pabst and Schlitz had to essentially rebuild their brewing operations from scratch, hiring new workers, retraining people. Gettleman flipped a switch. The company was producing beer again by April 1933, one of the first in Milwaukee. The extra pale lager tasted identical to the 1919 version, because the same people who'd been making it in 1919 were making it in 1933. The 13-year gap might as well have not existed, and now they had something their competitors didn't: a customer base that had spent 13 years buying their malt extract and successfully brewing with it at home. Irwin's marketing strategy was brilliant. The first advertising campaign after Prohibition featured the slogan, "The beer you learned to make, now made perfectly." It worked. Sales in 1934 reached 35,000 barrels. By 1936, they were at 48,000 barrels. The price remained premium, $14 per barrel when competitors were at $6 to $8. The profit margin remained absurd. The Prohibition period revealed something crucial about Gettleman's business model. They weren't actually in the beer business. They were in the premium experience business. The product could change from beer to malt extract and back to beer. But what they were really selling was the guarantee of quality to people who could afford to care about the difference. That understanding would carry them through the Depression, through World War II, and into the most profitable period in the company's history. By 1940, Milwaukee was the beer capital of America. Not by volume, St. Louis had more production, but by concentration. The city had 37 operating breweries, population 587,000. You could argue that beer was Milwaukee's identity in a way it wasn't for any other American city. Gettleman occupied a unique position in this ecosystem. While Pabst, Schlitz, Blatz, and Miller fought for national market share, Gettleman stayed relentlessly regional. 17 states carried Gettelman beer, but 93% of sales were in Wisconsin. 68% were in Milwaukee County alone. This wasn't failure to expand, it was strategic focus. The post-Depression years had taught Irwin something important. National distribution required pricing compromises. To ship beer across the country profitably, you had to either raise prices to cover shipping costs or lower quality to maintain margins. Gettleman wasn't willing to do either. Instead, they doubled down on being Milwaukee's premium choice. The marketing was locally focused but sophisticated. Gettleman sponsored Milwaukee Brewers minor league baseball. The company name appeared on the right field wall at Borchert Field. Every home run that cleared the fence earned the hitter a case of Gettelman Extra Pale. The symbolism was perfect. Premium achievement rewarded with premium beer. The restaurant and hotel partnerships expanded. By 1945, Gettleman was the exclusive beer at the Pfister Hotel, Milwaukee's finest. It was the only beer served at the Wisconsin Club, where the city's elite conducted business over lunch. It was the preferred beer at German-American social clubs that still maintained the old country traditions. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. Successful men drank Gettelman. Men who wanted to appear successful drank Gettelman. Men who wanted to actually be successful worked hard enough to afford Gettelman. Production in 1945, 67,000 barrels. Production in 1950, 112,000 barrels. The facility was running at capacity. Irwin faced a choice: expand the brewery or maintain the volume ceiling. He chose expansion, but in a very Gettelman way. Instead of building a massive new facility in the suburbs where land was cheap, he bought the adjacent buildings on Juneau Avenue and converted them. The brewery now occupied an entire city block, 6 connected buildings, all devoted to making one type of beer. The workforce grew to 420 people. The wages were the highest in Milwaukee brewing. The company offered health insurance in 1947, almost unheard of for a brewery that size. Pension plans in 1949. Why? Because Irwin understood that precision brewing was a craft that required experienced workers. A new employee took 3 years to fully train. Turnover was expensive. Better to pay people enough that they never wanted to leave. But here's where the story gets complicated. By 1955, Gettelman was producing 157,000 barrels annually. The price per barrel had climbed to $19, still 3 times the industry average for standard lager. The company was absurdly profitable. Irwin was 63 years old. His son Carl was 38, working as production manager, being groomed to take over eventually. Everything looked perfect. The brand was strong. The profits were consistent. The market position seemed unassailable. But outside Milwaukee, the beer industry was transforming in ways that made Gettelman's model increasingly vulnerable. National brands were consolidating. Advertising was shifting from local radio to national television. Distribution networks were becoming critical. And most importantly, the premium beer category was being redefined by brands that could be premium and also ubiquitous. What I find fascinating about this period is how obvious the warning signs look in retrospect, and how invisible they clearly were at the time. Gettleman was making more money than ever. Every metric pointed to success, but the foundation that success was built on, regional loyalty, premium positioning in a market that valued craft over convenience, was beginning to crack. Not because Gettelman was doing anything wrong, because the world was changing faster than their business model could adapt. 1958 was Gettelman's best year ever. Production: 183,000 barrels. Revenue: $3.47 million. Net profit: $847,000. Those numbers made Gettleman one of the most profitable small breweries in America. Profit margin of 24.4%, compared to an industry average of 8.3%. The company employed 687 people. They had contracts with 342 restaurants and hotels across Wisconsin. The brand was synonymous with quality in Milwaukee. But let's talk about what those numbers actually meant. 183,000 barrels sounds impressive until you compare it to the national players. In 1958, Anheuser-Busch produced 8.4 million barrels. Schlitz produced 6.2 million. Pabst produced 5.3 million. Even in Milwaukee, Miller was at 2.7 million barrels. Gettelman's 183,000 barrels gave them 2.3% of the Wisconsin market and less than 0.2% of the national market. Premium pricing was still working, but the gap was narrowing. Gettelman's Extra Pale sold for $19 per barrel. Budweiser was at $9. The quality difference was real. Blind taste tests consistently rated Gettleman higher, but the price difference was 111%. That math worked when beer was primarily consumed in restaurants and bars where atmosphere and status mattered. It worked less well as Americans increasingly bought beer in grocery stores to drink at home. Irwin saw this coming. In 1957, he commissioned a market research study, one of the first ever conducted by a Milwaukee brewery. The findings were uncomfortable. Gettleman had near-universal name recognition among Milwaukee men over 40. Among men under 30, recognition dropped to 38%. The younger demographic thought Gettleman was old man beer. They were drinking Budweiser and Miller High Life, brands that advertised heavily, that projected youth and energy, that were available everywhere. The study recommended 3 strategies: reduce pricing to compete more directly with national brands, increase distribution to at least 10 additional states, and launch a national advertising campaign. Estimated cost: $2.3 million over 3 years. Expected result: doubling production to 350,000 barrels annually within 5 years. Irwin said no, not because he disagreed with the analysis, because implementing it would fundamentally transform what Gettleman was. Lower prices meant different ingredients or different processes. Wider distribution meant shipping beer longer distances, which meant pasteurization and preservatives that affected flavor. National advertising meant competing against companies with budgets 50 times larger. Gettleman would become a mediocre national brand instead of an excellent regional one. This is the moment where the story really begins, even if nobody understood that yet, because Irwin's decision was both completely correct and completely fatal. He was right that transforming Gettleman into a national brand would destroy what made it special. But by choosing not to transform, he was choosing to remain in a category that was slowly disappearing. Here's the thing about Irvin Gettleman: his greatest strength and his fatal flaw were exactly the same quality. He was uncompromising about quality to a degree that bordered on obsessive. That uncompromising nature had made Gettleman successful for a century. But in the late 1950s, the beer industry was entering a period where compromise was the price of survival. By 1959, the cracks were becoming visible. Production dropped slightly to 176,000 barrels. Still profitable, still premium. But the trajectory had reversed. Younger drinkers weren't developing Gettleman loyalty the way previous generations had. The restaurant and hotel contracts remained solid, but retail sales were flat. The grocery store buyers wanted beer that moved volume, not beer that sat on shelves at premium prices. Irwin was 67. Carl was 42. Father and son disagreed fundamentally about the future. Carl thought Gettleman needed to modernize, not abandon quality, but adapt to changing market realities. Irwin thought adaptation meant surrender. The arguments became intense. Carl proposed a second product line, a standard-priced lager that could compete with Miller and Budweiser, while the Extra Pale maintained its premium position. Irwin refused. One beer, one standard, no compromises. In retrospect, both of them were trapped. Carl's proposal might have worked, but it also might have diluted the brand and failed anyway. Irwin's stubbornness preserved what Gettleman was, but made it increasingly irrelevant. There wasn't a right answer. There was only a choice between different kinds of decline. The approach came in February 1960. Not a formal offer initially, just a conversation. Frederick Miller II, president of Miller Brewing, invited Irwin Gettelman to lunch at the University Club. They'd known each other for years, competed against each other, maintained cordial professional relations. This wasn't unusual. What Frederick proposed was unusual. Miller wanted to buy Gettleman, not to shut it down, to preserve it as a premium subsidiary. Keep the name, keep the recipes, keep most of the workers. But leverage Miller's distribution network and advertising budget to make Gettleman a national premium brand. The initial offer was $4.2 million for the company, the brand, the facility, everything. Irwin's response was immediate. No, not interested. Gettleman was a family business, had been for 104 years, would continue to be. Frederick said he understood, thanked him for his time, and they finished lunch talking about baseball. But Frederick Miller was persistent. Over the next 6 months, the offer kept evolving. The price increased to $4.8 million. The terms became more favorable. Irwin could stay on as a consultant. Carl could manage the Gettleman operations. The Extra Pale recipe would remain unchanged. Frederick painted a vision. Gettleman beer in every major American city, available to discerning drinkers coast to coast, the premium choice for people who understood quality. Irwin remained unconvinced, but Carl was increasingly interested, not because of the money, though $4.8 million was a fortune, but because he genuinely believed Miller could take Gettleman national without destroying what made it special. The arguments between father and son intensified. Carl said staying independent meant slow decline. Irwin said selling out meant immediate death, even if the brand name survived. Here's what made the situation complicated. They were both right. Miller genuinely did want to maintain Gettleman as a premium brand. Toward efficiency and standardization. Carl believed Miller's promises because he wanted to believe them. Irwin doubted them because he understood that corporate structures eventually override individual commitments. The turning point came in September 1960. Gettleman's third-quarter numbers showed production at 41,000 barrels, down from 47,000 the previous year. Profits were down 18%. The trend was clear. Without major investment in marketing and distribution, Gettleman was facing long-term decline. But Irwin was 68, Carl was 43, and neither of them wanted to risk family money on a transformation that might fail. Miller revised their offer one final time, $5.1 million, payment in cash, and Miller stock. Irwin and Carl would both stay involved for 5 years. The Gettleman facility would remain operational as a specialty brewing operation. The Extra Pale recipe was guaranteed to remain unchanged for a minimum of 10 years. It was the best offer they were going to get. In November 1960, Irwin called a family meeting. His wife, Carl's wife, Irwin's daughter, who'd never worked in the brewery but owned a minority stake through her inheritance from Louis. He laid out the numbers, the offer, the alternatives. The family voted, 3 in favor of selling, 2 against. Irwin was one of the 2 against. But he was 70 years old, tired, and increasingly uncertain that his stubbornness was wisdom or just stubbornness. The sale was announced on January 12, 1961. Miller Brewing Company acquires Gettelman Brewing Company for $5.1 million. The press release emphasized continuity. The Gettleman name would continue. The tradition would be preserved. Milwaukee was gaining a stronger, more competitive brewing sector. Everyone said the right things. What's remarkable about this decision is that it seemed completely rational at the time, which is what makes it so instructive. Irwin wasn't giving up. He was accepting reality. A regional premium brewery couldn't survive in an industry dominated by national brands with massive advertising budgets. Better to sell to someone who appreciated the brand than to watch it slowly fade into irrelevance. The logic was sound. The outcome was devastating. Miller took possession on March 1, 1961. The transition was supposed to be gradual. For the first year, nothing much changed. The Gettleman facility kept operating. The same 687 workers showed up every day. The extra pale lager was still brewed to the same specifications. Irwin came in 3 days a week as a consultant. Carl was technically in charge of Gettelman operations within the Miller structure. But institutional logic works faster than promises. By June 1961, Miller's operations team was studying Gettelman's processes. The spectrophotometer measurements seemed excessive. The hand inspection of every bottle was wildly inefficient. The 6-month aging period could be reduced to 4 months without significant flavor impact. These weren't criticisms exactly, just observations about how processes could be optimized. Carl pushed back. These processes were what made Gettleman special. Miller's response was reasonable. We're not changing anything yet. We're just studying efficiency opportunities. But the studying never stopped, and the pressure for efficiency kept building. The first actual change came in August 1961. Miller's distribution team wanted to ship Gettleman to new markets: California, Illinois, New York. But shipping beer across the country required pasteurization to prevent spoilage. Gettleman had never pasteurized. Irwin argued that pasteurization altered the flavor profile. Miller's technical team ran tests, blind taste panels. The results showed that most people couldn't tell the difference between pasteurized and unpasteurized Gettleman. Think about that for a second. Most people couldn't tell the difference, but most people weren't Gettleman's customers. Gettleman's customers were the ones who could tell the difference, who cared about the difference, who paid premium prices specifically because of that difference. But in Miller's operational logic, optimizing for most people made sense. It's what large companies do. The California shipments started in September 1961. Pasteurized Gettleman Extra Pale sold at $14 per barrel instead of $19 because shipping costs required some price adjustment. It sold poorly. Not because it was bad beer, it was still good beer. But it was competing against established California brands, had no local reputation, and was priced at a premium that the California market didn't understand or value. Production numbers told the story. 1961, 168,000 barrels total, down from 176,000 the previous year. 1962, 153,000 barrels. The decline was partly market conditions, partly Miller's focus shifting toward their own flagship products. Gettleman was supposed to be the premium subsidiary, but it was getting less attention and investment than Miller High Life. Employment started dropping, not through layoffs initially, through attrition. Workers would leave, and their positions wouldn't be filled. By the end of 1962, the Gettelman facility employed 542 people instead of 687. Some had been reassigned to Miller's main brewery. Some had retired. Some had quit rather than work for a large corporation. Irwin stopped coming in by early 1963. Not officially, he just gradually showed up less and less. Carl told people his father was dealing with health issues, which was partly true. But mostly, Irwin couldn't stand watching what was happening. The processes he'd perfected over decades were being optimized. The standards his grandfather had established were being questioned. The beer was still being made, still being sold, but it wasn't Gettleman anymore. It was Miller's idea of what Gettleman should be. By 1964, Miller's executive team was having explicit conversations about the Gettleman brand's future. The premium positioning wasn't working nationally. The brand lacked recognition outside Wisconsin. Was valuable real estate right in Milwaukee's industrial corridor, but operating it as a separate brewery was inefficient. Carl fought for another year, proposed focusing back on Wisconsin, rebuilding the regional strength. But Miller wasn't interested in regional brands anymore. They were building a national portfolio. Gettleman either needed to become a national premium brand, which required investments Miller wasn't willing to make, or it needed to be phased out. The announcement came on April 14, 1966. Miller Brewing Company would discontinue Gettelman Extra Pale Lager after 110 years of continuous production. The official statement thanked Gettleman's loyal customers, acknowledged the brand's historic importance to Milwaukee, and explained that market conditions no longer supported specialty production. The final batch was brewed on June 3, 1966. The workers knew it was the final batch, though officially it wasn't announced that way. Irwin came in for the first time in 2 years. He stood in the brewing room, the room his grandfather had designed, his father had perfected, he had modernized, and watched the process one last time. Here's where it gets devastating. The beer brewed that day was perfect. The measurements were exact. The hops were Saaz from Bohemia. The malt was premium 6-row barley. The aging would be the full 6 months. It was Gettelman Extra Pale, exactly as it had always been. The last batch was as good as the first batch Adam Gettleman had brewed in 1856. But perfection didn't matter anymore. The market had moved on. The final batch produced 1,847 barrels, the exact amount of money Adam had saved to start the brewery 110 years earlier. That coincidence was unplanned, but it was noticed. Some of the workers who'd been there for decades saw it as symbolic, the beginning and the end connected by a number. The beer was released to distributors in October 1966. Most of it sat on shelves. The customers who'd been loyal to Gettleman for decades bought a few cases, stockpiled them, knowing this was the end. But there weren't enough loyal customers left to clear the inventory. By December, distributors were returning unsold cases to Miller. The beer that had once been Milwaukee's most exclusive product was being sold at clearance prices. Irwin Gettleman died on January 22, 1967, 3 months before his 75th birthday. The obituary in the Milwaukee Journal called him the last of Milwaukee's artisan brewers. It was meant as a compliment, but it acknowledged what everyone knew. The era of small, family-owned, quality-focused breweries was over. The future belonged to national brands, mass production, and marketing budgets larger than Gettleman's total historical revenue. The facility closed in March 1967. The 387 remaining workers were offered positions at Miller's main brewery. About 200 took the offer. The rest retired, found other work, or left Milwaukee entirely. The equipment was sold, some to small craft breweries, some scrapped for metal value. The copper brewing vessels that had produced Gettleman beer for a century were melted down and turned into industrial piping. What happened next was almost worse than the closure. Miller kept the facility for 18 months, using it for storage. Then, in September 1968, they demolished it. All 6 buildings, the entire city block. The brick walls that had survived fire, prohibition, depression, 2 world wars. Gone in 3 weeks. The symbolism was devastating. Miller didn't just discontinue the beer. They erased the physical evidence that Gettleman had ever existed. The parking lot that stands there today was poured in October 1968. It's been repaved 6 times since then, but it's the same parking lot. The same space where 800 workers once produced beer that Milwaukee's elite considered worth paying triple the going rate. Carl Gettelman stayed with Miller until 1971, then left the beer industry entirely, went into commercial real estate, refused to discuss Gettleman in interviews. The one time he did talk about it, in 1983, he said something that stayed with me. "We sold the company to save the beer. Miller bought the company to get the real estate. Those were always different goals. We just didn't understand that until it was too late." The easy explanation is that Miller killed Gettleman, bought a beloved brand, stripped it for parts, demolished the evidence. That explanation is emotionally satisfying and largely wrong. What actually happened is more complicated and more instructive. First lesson: premium brands require premium infrastructure, not just in production, but in distribution, marketing, and customer relationships. Gettleman had the production infrastructure. They had a century of expertise in making exceptional beer. But they had no national distribution network, no advertising capability, no mechanism to explain to customers outside Wisconsin why this beer was worth 3 times the price of Budweiser. Here's the specific example. When Gettleman tried to expand to California in 1961, they were competing against Anchor Steam, a local premium beer with local loyalty, and national brands that had established distribution relationships. Gettleman had neither local connection nor national scale. The premium price seemed arbitrary to California buyers. Without the Milwaukee context, the history, the exclusivity, the social status association, it was just expensive beer. What competitors did differently? Look at Sam Adams in the 1980s. They built a premium beer brand nationally, but they did it with massive marketing investment, storytelling that explained the premium price, and distribution partnerships that got them into the right stores and bars. Gettleman tried to go national without any of that infrastructure. They assumed quality alone would justify premium pricing. It didn't. Second lesson: regional loyalty is an asset until it becomes a cage. Gettleman's deep roots in Milwaukee were their strength for a century. But those same roots prevented them from adapting when the market shifted. They were Milwaukee's beer to a degree that made it hard to be anyone else's beer. The specific example: in 1959, Milwaukee had 587,000 residents. Gettleman was selling 176,000 barrels, mostly in Milwaukee County. That meant they needed roughly 60% market penetration among Milwaukee adults to maintain that volume. They had achieved that through generations of brand loyalty. But Milwaukee's population was declining, down to 563,000 by 1965. And younger residents weren't developing Gettleman loyalty. The math didn't work. Either expand geographically or accept inevitable decline. What they could have done differently: Anchor Steam stayed resolutely local, but modernized their marketing and production to attract younger drinkers while maintaining quality. Gettleman could have done the same, reposition as Milwaukee's heritage beer for a new generation. But that would have required acknowledging that the old customer base was literally dying off and needed to be replaced. Third lesson: in consolidating industries, independence is only viable at scale or in niches. Gettleman was neither large enough to compete with national brands, nor niche enough to be sustainable as a specialty producer. Here's the math that killed them. In 1960, Gettleman's profit margin of 24% seemed unassailable, but it was based on producing 183,000 barrels. To maintain that margin while producing less, as the market was forcing them to do, they'd have to raise prices further. But prices were already triple the competition. The alternative was to increase volume, but That required capital investment they didn't want to make, and market expansion that would compromise quality. What competitors did. Sierra Nevada started in 1980 and stayed niche deliberately. Produced 1,000 barrels the first year, focused on a specific craft beer customer who valued quality over convenience. But they did it in an era when craft beer was becoming a category, not an oddity. Gettleman's timing was wrong. They were premium in an era when the market wanted either cheap or national. Fourth lesson, and this is specific to Gettelman's story. Selling to a larger competitor only works if your goals align with their incentives. Gettleman sold to preserve the beer. Miller bought to eliminate a competitor and acquire real estate. Those misaligned incentives meant the outcome was predetermined. Miller's internal documents from 1964, released in a legal case 30 years later, show that executives were discussing phasing out Gettelman production within 2 years of the acquisition. The promises to maintain the brand were sincere when made, but corporate logic overrode them. Gettelman's production costs were higher than Miller's standard products. The sales volumes didn't justify the complexity. The real estate was valuable. The math led inevitably to closure. The parallel with what happened to dozens of craft breweries bought by AB InBev in the 2000s is hard to ignore. The acquiring company promises independence, promises to maintain the brand's character, and they mean it. But large organizations have their own gravitational pull. Efficiency pressures, standardization demands, profit expectations that specialty products can't meet. The brand survives in name, but dies in substance. I think this is why this story still matters, not as a cautionary tale about selling out, but as a reminder of how quickly the landscape can shift under your feet. Gettleman made rational decisions at every step. They built quality. They maintained standards. They sold when independence seemed unsustainable. Every decision made sense in isolation, but the cumulative result was erasure. Corner of Juneau and 4th Street today. The parking lot is mostly empty. Faded painted lines, cracked asphalt, a chain link fence around the perimeter. Miller uses it for overflow truck parking. There's no plaque, no historical marker, nothing to indicate that Milwaukee's most exclusive beer was produced here for 110 years. But the memory persists in unexpected ways. Collectors pay $400 to $600 for unopened bottles of Gettelman Extra Pale. Not many exist. The beer was meant to be consumed, not saved. But the few bottles that survive represent something more than beer. They represent an approach to business that doesn't exist anymore. Quality as the only metric, precision over profit, exclusivity as virtue rather than marketing strategy. A Milwaukee bar called The Vanguard found 3 bottles in their basement in 2019, unopened from the final 1966 batch. They held a tasting event, charged $100 per person for a 2-ounce pour. 43 people showed up. Most of them weren't even born when Gettleman closed. But they'd heard the stories from fathers or grandfathers about the beer that Milwaukee's working class couldn't afford, about the brewery that chose to die rather than compromise. The beer was still good, 53 years old, stored improperly, probably far past any reasonable shelf life. But the chemistry of premium brewing, the hop selection, the malt quality, the lagering process, had created something durable. Reviewers called it complex, layered, distinctly different from modern lagers. Whether that was genuine or projection doesn't really matter. The experience was about connection to a disappeared past. Think about what that actually means. People paid $100 to taste 2 ounces of beer from a brewery that's been gone for 50 years. Produced by a company that was demolished in a spot now used for truck parking. That's not nostalgia for the beer. That's nostalgia for a time when businesses were built to last generations when quality was measured in decades rather than quarters, when a family could spend 110 years perfecting one product and consider that a successful life's work. The Gettleman story is usually told as a tragedy, Milwaukee's finest brewery killed by corporate consolidation, but I think it's more complicated than that. Yes, Miller bought Gettleman and phased out production. But Gettleman was already dying. The market had shifted. Regional premium brewers couldn't survive in an industry dominated by national brands. Miller just accelerated the inevitable. The real tragedy isn't that Gettleman disappeared. It's that the approach to business it represented disappeared. The idea that you could spend a century getting really, really good at one thing, that you could optimize for quality over growth. That premium could mean genuinely better, not just better marketed. Those ideas seem quaint now, almost naive. But they built a business that lasted 110 years and produced beer that people still seek out half a century after the last batch. Adam Gettelman arrived in Milwaukee in 1850 with 60 marks and his father's brewing notes. By the time his great-grandson closed the brewery in 1967, the Gettelman family had produced approximately 8.7 million barrels of beer over 110 years. That's an average of 79,000 barrels annually. A rounding error for Anheuser-Busch. A lifetime's work for 4 generations of one family. The parking lot sits empty most days. But every few months, someone pulls in, gets out of their car, and just stands there for a few minutes, looking at nothing in particular, holding an old photograph maybe, or a bottle label, or just a memory of a story their grandfather told them, about the beer that made Milwaukee jealous, about the $1,000 beer that actually cost $19 but felt priceless, about the brewery that chose to die rather than compromise. There's no historical marker. Milwaukee has bigger beer histories to commemorate. Pabst, Schlitz, Miller. But the people who stop in that parking lot aren't interested in the big histories. They're interested in the small one. The one about precision and stubbornness and quality as an end in itself. The one that ended in an empty parking lot but somehow still matters 50 years later. That's the legacy of Gettelman Brewing Company. Not the beer, which is gone. Not the building, which was demolished. But the idea that something built to last forever can disappear completely and still leave traces. In $500 bottles. In family stories. In the empty space where something excellent once stood and refused to be anything less than excellent, right up until the moment it ceased to exist at all.